It was late when I found myself at her door again, the evening slipping into quiet shadows. I hadn't planned to stay long, just to drop something off, to help her carry a few heavy boxes from the car, the kind of small errands that gave me an excuse to see her without ever admitting how much I wanted to. Her house always felt different at night, softer somehow. The curtains were half drawn, letting in threads of streetlight that played against the warm glow of her lamps. She thanked me in that calm, graceful way of hers, the kind of voice that could make even the simplest words feel significant. I was gathering my things, ready to leave, when she suddenly spoke again. "Stay here tonight," she said quietly, almost as if testing the sound of the words. "And I'll show you the truth." For a moment, I froze where I stood. The words settled in the air between us, carrying a weight I couldn't quite measure. My mind ran in circles, questioning what she meant. Did she sense my feelings and mean to address them directly? Or was she speaking of something else entirely? Something about her life, her past, the things she never spoke about? Her eyes held mine, steady but not unguarded. There was something vulnerable behind them, like she was giving me a choice, to step into her world a little closer, or to retreat before crossing a line neither of us could uncross. The air around us seemed heavier. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, warm and floral, drifting as she moved closer to tidy the edge of the table. The movement was ordinary, but the silence it left behind was not. I became aware of how small the room felt, how the walls seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came. What could I possibly say? If I agreed too quickly, it might seem reckless. If I refused, I might lose the chance to know her in a way that had nothing to do with errands or polite smiles. Inside, my heart beat harder than I wanted her to see. I remembered every fleeting glance we had shared, every pause in conversation where neither of us seemed ready to let the moment end. And now, here she was asking me to stay, yet not for reasons I could pin down. Her expression didn't waver, but I could sense a quiet storm beneath it. She wasn't daring me, and she wasn't seducing me. It felt more fragile than that. It felt like an invitation born out of trust, maybe even out of loneliness. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how loud the clock sounded on the wall. My hand lingered near the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to use it. The truth, whatever that meant, it was waiting for me here, in this house where the night stretched long and unspoken things pressed close. And even before I answered, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. The moment I agreed to stay, the house seemed to shift around me. Not in any visible way. Nothing moved, nothing changed, but I could feel the difference, like the air itself had grown heavier with meaning. She didn't smile or press the moment further. Instead, she simply nodded, almost with relief, and moved toward the kitchen. "Have you eaten?" she asked, her tone casual, as though she hadn't just altered the course of the night with one sentence. I shook my head, though food was the last thing on my mind. She moved gracefully, opening cupboards, setting out plates, filling the silence with the soft clink of dishes. I stood awkwardly for a moment before following her, drawn by the faint warmth spilling from the kitchen light. The table was set simply. 2 plates, 2 cups of tea she brewed with practiced ease. She handed me mine, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest second. The touch was small, barely intentional, but it lingered in me like the echo of a bell. We sat across from each other, the table between us, steam curling gently from our cups. For a while, neither of us said much. She asked about my day. I told her in clipped sentences, noticing how her eyes stayed on me, as if searching for something beneath my words. She responded with stories about the week, little details, everyday things, but behind them I sensed something unsaid. The food was warm and comforting, though I could barely taste it. Every sound seemed magnified. The scrape of my fork, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the wall clock. And through it all, the silence stretched, not empty, but weighted, as though both of us were waiting for the other to name what hung between us. At one point, she reached for the salt, and her wrist brushed against mine. It was nothing, really, yet everything. My hand stilled, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. I felt my pulse in my throat and my fingers in the air between us. The longer we sat, the more I noticed the details I often ignored. The faint lines near her eyes that deepened when she smiled. The way her hair fell forward, catching the light in soft, muted strands. The quiet steadiness of her presence. It was grounding and unsettling all at once. I caught myself staring once or twice. When her gaze met mine, she didn't look away. She held it calmly, and then lowered her eyes to her plate with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. That unspoken rhythm carried us through the meal. Words here and there, pauses that felt louder than any sentence, glances that lasted a moment too long. By the time we finished, I realized I hadn't just shared food with her. I had stepped further into her world, into her silence, into the spaces she rarely let anyone see. And somehow, I didn't want to leave those spaces ever again. When the plates were cleared and the teacups were empty, she didn't rise from her chair. She sat there quietly, her fingers resting against the rim of her cup as if she were holding onto it for courage. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but I could feel a shift happening, like she had reached a threshold and was deciding whether to cross it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table when she finally spoke. "There's a reason I asked you to stay tonight." Her voice was softer now, almost unsure, though it carried the same calm steadiness I had come to know. I leaned forward slightly, waiting, careful not to interrupt. She took a breath, her hand tightening around the cup. "People see me a certain way," she continued. "Strong, capable, untouchable even. And I've let them believe it, because it's easier than explaining what's underneath." Her words hung in the air, and I noticed how her shoulders stiffened as if bracing for judgment. But I said nothing, I just listened. She glanced at me then, only briefly, before looking away again. "The truth is, I've made mistakes. I've carried regrets longer than I should have. I've spent years building walls so high that even I started believing I didn't need anyone." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I do." For the first time that evening, her voice cracked, and in that small fracture, I saw the weight she carried. She wasn't confessing a scandal. She wasn't telling me some dark secret. She was showing me her humanity, the kind she usually kept hidden beneath polished words and graceful composure. I could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly, in the way her eyes shimmered when she finally dared to meet mine. She was letting me see not the woman who held everything together, but the woman who sometimes felt like she was falling apart. Something in my chest tightened. I wanted to reach for her, to take her hand again, but I hesitated. It felt like a sacred moment, and I didn't want to break it with clumsy comfort. So instead, I stayed still, letting her voice guide the silence. "There are nights," she whispered, "when the house feels too quiet, when even the walls remind me of what I've lost. And tonight, I didn't want to sit in that silence alone." Her confession struck deeper than I expected. It wasn't loneliness in the ordinary sense. It was the kind that grows slowly, invisibly, until it becomes part of who you are. She looked at me fully then, her gaze steady, though her vulnerability was laid bare. "That's the truth I wanted you to see. Not the version everyone else knows. Just me, as I really am." The weight of her words settled into me like a promise, like a fragile trust handed over. And in that moment, I knew I didn't want to be anywhere else but here, seeing her exactly as she was. Her words lingered in the room long after they were spoken, threading through the quiet in a way that made everything feel heavier, more intimate. I watched her as she lowered her eyes again, her lashes casting faint shadows on her cheeks. She was trying to steady herself, but I could see the way her breath caught, the faint tremor in her shoulders. It felt wrong to let her sit there alone in that silence. Before I could think too much about it, I reached across the table, my hand sliding slowly until it found hers. Her fingers were warm, softer than I imagined, though I could feel the faint tension in them, as if she was debating whether to pull away. But she didn't. She let my hand rest over hers, her pulse quick beneath my touch. For a long moment, she said nothing, and neither did I. I could feel her letting me in, not through words, but through the simple choice of not moving away. And in that silence, the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, bound by the weight of a single touch. When she finally looked up, her eyes carried something unguarded, something I had never seen from her before. Vulnerability, yes, but also trust. It wasn't the trust you give lightly. It was the kind you hand over when you're not sure if you'll ever get it back. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but instead she exhaled slowly, a breath that brushed the space between us like an unspoken admission. I tightened my fingers just slightly around hers, a gentle reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere. She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made my chest ache. "You don't know what you're stepping into?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe not," I answered softly, "but I know I want to be here." Something shifted in her expression then. A faint smile flickered at the corner of her mouth, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not yet. It was cautious, almost fragile. Still, she let her thumb move ever so slightly against my hand, a barely there gesture that felt more powerful than words. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and indifferent, but for us, time had slowed. I became acutely aware of everything. The warmth of her skin beneath my palm, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the air, the closeness that wrapped around us like a quiet storm. When she finally withdrew her hand, it wasn't abrupt. She let it linger in mine for a breath longer, as if reluctant to break the connection. And when she did, it wasn't a retreat, it was an invitation. She stood slowly, smoothing her blouse, and looked toward the window where the night waited. "Come," she said softly, glancing back at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "Let's step outside for a while." And just like that, I knew the night was far from over. The door opened with a soft creak, and the cool night air slipped inside, brushing against my skin with a gentle shiver. She stepped out first, pulling a light cardigan around her shoulders, her movements unhurried but purposeful, as though she needed the open air as much as breath itself. I followed, letting the door close quietly behind us. The street was hushed, the kind of silence that only comes deep into the night when even the city seems to be sleeping. A few street lamps spilled pale light onto the pavement, and the faint sound of crickets carried from somewhere beyond. Above us, the sky stretched wide and endless, scattered with stars that blinked like secrets too distant to touch. We walked without a destination, our steps slow, almost aimless. For a while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, filled with everything words couldn't quite hold. The rhythm of her steps matched mine, close enough that every so often her shoulder brushed lightly against my arm. Each time it happened, I felt the quiet spark of contact ripple through me, subtle but undeniable. At one point, she folded her arms against the chill, and without thinking, I moved closer. She didn't step away. Instead, her arm eased, and she let the space between us narrow until her sleeve grazed mine. It was such a small thing, yet it felt like a choice, one she didn't have to make but did. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was softer than before, almost reflective. "I used to walk these streets at night when I couldn't sleep," she said, her eyes tracing the path ahead. "It made me feel less alone, like the night was listening even if no one else was." I glanced at her, catching the way the lamplight touched her features, softening them into something almost dreamlike. "And tonight?" I asked gently. She turned her head, her eyes finding mine in the dim light. "Tonight, I don't feel the need to walk alone." Her words settled into me like warmth against the cool air. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I let the silence answer for both of us, the quiet closeness speaking louder than anything else could. As we rounded the corner, a breeze stirred, lifting strands of her hair across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached to tuck it gently behind her ear. She didn't flinch, didn't move away. She just looked at me, her eyes holding mine for a long, lingering moment before turning forward again. We kept walking, slower now, as if trying to stretch the night a little longer. The world felt smaller, quieter, almost suspended in time. And though nothing had been confessed outright, I could feel it, the invisible thread pulling us closer, weaving something unspoken but undeniable between us. By the time we turned back toward the house, I realized I wasn't just walking beside her. I was walking into something deeper, something I wasn't sure I fully understood yet, but something I knew I wanted to. When we stepped back inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around us again, but the silence that followed felt different now. It wasn't the quiet of hesitation anymore. It was the quiet of something on the verge of breaking open. She slipped off her cardigan and set it over the back of a chair, moving with that same calm grace, yet her shoulders seemed heavier somehow. I stayed near the doorway for a moment, watching her. She paused by the window, her hand resting lightly on the frame as she looked out into the night we had just left behind. The lamplight traced the curve of her face, and I noticed the way her lips pressed together, as though she were holding back words that had been waiting far too long. Finally, she turned toward me. Her eyes met mine, and this time she didn't look away. "There's something I need to say," she began, her voice low, threaded with a vulnerability that made me take a cautious step closer. I didn't speak. I just waited, giving her the space she seemed to need. "I've lived most of my life pretending I don't need anyone," she continued, her arms folding loosely across her chest, as if to shield herself from the weight of her own words. "People look at me and see strength, composure, independence. And maybe part of that is true. But what they don't see," she faltered, her voice softening, "what they don't see is how empty it feels sometimes. How heavy the nights can be when there's no one to share them with." Her confession cut through me in a way I hadn't expected. She wasn't telling me something dramatic or shocking. She was handing me her loneliness, raw and unpolished, the kind she never let anyone else glimpse. I stepped closer until I was only a few feet away. "You don't have to carry all of that alone," I said quietly. Her eyes shimmered, and she shook her head almost imperceptibly. "That's easy for you to say. You still have time. Choices. People who understand you. For me," she trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. "For me, it feels like time is slipping faster than I can hold it." Without thinking, I reached up, brushing my thumb lightly across her cheek as a tear began to fall. She didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her eyes closing for the briefest moment as though she had been waiting for this, for someone to see her, not the mask she wore. When her gaze opened again, it was steady, almost searching. "That's the truth I wanted you to know," she whispered. "Not strength, not composure, just me, with all the fear and all the flaws." I kept my hand against her cheek, my heart thundering in my chest. "Then let me see you like this," I said softly, "because it's the only version of you I want." And in that moment, the air between us shifted. It wasn't just vulnerability anymore. It was connection, fragile and real, binding us closer than either of us had expected. The house felt quieter than ever, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was tender, like a blanket drawn gently around us. She stood close enough that I could still feel the warmth of her skin where my hand had rested moments before. Neither of us rushed to speak. It was as if words had done their part, and what remained now could only be held in the stillness. She moved first, walking toward the living room. I followed, my steps instinctively matching hers. She sank onto the couch with a softness that seemed almost weary, as though laying down not just her body, but all the weight she had carried alone for years. For a second, I hesitated, unsure if I should sit beside her or give her space. But then she looked up at me with an expression that was neither command nor question. It was an invitation. I sat down, not too close at first, but enough that our shoulders nearly brushed. The lamp in the corner cast a warm glow across the room, turning the shadows into something gentle. She exhaled a long, quiet breath and leaned ever so slightly toward me, her head finding its way to my shoulder. The moment her cheek rested there, something inside me stilled. My arm moved naturally, wrapping around her in a gesture that felt less like a choice and more like an instinct I had always carried. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She simply let herself be held, her body softening against mine. For a while, we sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the night beyond the windows. I became aware of the subtle rhythm of her breathing, steady and slow, as though she had finally allowed herself to rest. Every so often, I felt the brush of her hair against my jaw, delicate strands carrying the faintest trace of her perfume. In that quiet, I realized how rare this was, this trust, this closeness that didn't demand anything more than presence. It wasn't about grand declarations or promises. It was about being here in this moment without fear. She shifted slightly, tilting her face up toward me. Our eyes met, closer now, and I could see the question in hers, unspoken, fragile, but clear. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I let my forehead rest lightly against hers, a gesture so simple, yet so full of everything I couldn't say. Her hand slipped into mine then, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that made my chest ache. She gave the faintest squeeze, and I returned it, sealing something between us that no words could name. The night stretched on, but time seemed to lose its edge. I knew the world outside might never understand this connection, the quiet bond between someone like her and someone like me. But as she rested against me, her heartbeat steady beneath my arm, I understood something far more important. I wasn't here to fix her. I wasn't here to save her. I was here to stay, and that in its own quiet way was enough.